Hey everybody, let's talk about our fourth defining question today. We find it in Exodus 4. God has shown up in a burning bush and he's called a man named Moses to go confront Pharaoh and one of the strongest military forces on earth, and then to lead about 1 million people out of slavery across a desert and into a brand new homeland. Now, as you might imagine, Moses has a few questions like how, when, why me, and how do I even start to do something like that sounds that impossible? And in response, God asked Moses a question of his own. Verse 2 says, "Then the Lord asked him, 'What is that in your hand?' And Moses replied, 'A shepherd's staff.'" Now that's our fourth defining question. What do you have in your hand? Maybe you're still searching for the defining purpose in your life, or maybe you've begun to get a sense of direction and mission. But if I were guessing, the picture that is emerging in your mind might be much bigger or seems more difficult than you expected. So where do you start when the job seems impossible? God tells Moses to start with what he already has in his hand. Now, what do you have in your hand? And by this question, I'm not asking about your bank account. I'm asking about what skills, knowledge, relationships that you already possess. And in Moses' case, what he held in his hand was actually about the last thing he ever expected to have. Keep in mind, Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace, so he was raised in luxury and royalty. Second thing, Egyptians despise shepherds. All the way back in Genesis, Joseph tells his brothers before they come to Egypt that the Egyptians despise shepherds. So what would Moses have never expected to be? Moses would have thought he might be a prince. He might even be the next Pharaoh. At least he would have expected to grow up well-educated, well-connected, well-financed, and well-positioned for his future. Whatever the case, he certainly wouldn't have planned on spending years hanging out with smelly sheep. And yet, he had spent the last 40 years doing one of the least likely things he would have ever expected to do. He grew up planning to be a leader, but he never expected to reach 80 years old and have never led anything but a flock of sheep. However, it was in the obscurity of those years alone in the desert that Moses learned some very valuable skills. Think about what he learned. First of all, the man who once flew off the handle and murdered someone learned patience and compassion, because sheep will teach you both. The once proud palace dweller learned humility. In fact, in the book of Numbers, it says that Moses was the most humble man on earth. Third, he built a close relationship with God because there was no one else around. Much like David developed this entirely different relationship with God. God actually told the other Israelites that he spoke to prophets and other people through dreams, but that wasn't the way with Moses. Moses was his friend, and they spoke face to face. And then the fourth thing is he learned to live in the same wilderness through which he would spend the next 40 years, his last 40 years of life, leading the Israelites. In fact, when God calls him and says, "Go bring my people out of slavery," he says, "You'll come back to this exact mountain and worship." And it is on that same mountain where he encountered a burning bush and God's call that he also sees God and is given the 10 Commandments, and actually Mount Sinai it became known. So when God asks you what is in your hand, it may be something you never wanted to hold. However, there's a good chance that that's the very thing that's going to be the entry point to God's purpose in your life. Now I want to wrap up with a little personal story. When I first got out of college, I went on the road as a musician and singer and kind of thought that's what I would do. But there was this detour in my life that consisted of 13 years that I then spent in the car business. I never really wanted to do that. In fact, I found myself much like Moses in a job I never really was looking for. However, when my pastor approached me and hired me to come to work at my former church, and it was really the beginning of this path I've been on the last 20 years, a very interesting thing happened my first day. I walked into to his secretary's office. The pastor was actually gone to Phoenix for a conference. I walked in and she handed me a piece of paper with a man's name and phone number and said, "Pastor wants you to call this guy." And it turns out that there was a school next door to us that we had wanted to buy for as long as I can remember, but it was a Seventh-day Adventist school and they didn't want to sell. And then on this day, my first day, their pastor called and said, I think we're ready to talk about selling. And so when the secretary had called our pastor, he said, give that to Danny. That's right up his alley. And sure enough, the very first thing I find myself doing is not music. It's not media. It is negotiating, something I've been doing for the last 13 years and growing very good at. And so right now you might be thinking, man, I don't know the way forward. And I would encourage you, take a look in your hand. That shepherd's staff there might not be what you ever thought you'd hold, or maybe it is. Maybe it's what you spent your whole life preparing for. But whatever it is, God will usually start right there with what's in your hand. Be sure to tune in again tomorrow for question number 5.